Hey, welcome to this video. So what we'll do in this video is finish off with our interfaces so that if this big projectile that we've given ourselves here, this big test ball projectile, passes through the player or the enemies, you'll see that their health bars reduce correspondingly. The player's taken a few hits with that little swipe, the enemies have taken hits, and we'll find that the code on the projectile doesn't have to change when we add the enemy in, which is quite cool. We just add the enemy in as somebody who implements the damageable interface. So that's a pretty powerful concept that by the end of the video, hopefully you'll have grasped and you'll have made your enemy work. So I will see you in there. When we left you, we had this projectile and it was able to overlap with these game objects like players and enemies and print out what it's hit. Now we want to focus on the projectile code. We're actually going to tell it to call a method on an enemy, for example, or a player, and actually deal some damage. So we have a method on the player called take damage, and we've determined how to implement that for the player, and what we need to do is be able to call it. So let me talk you through that on a slide first, and then to get the general pattern of it, and then we'll write the code, and then I'll challenge you to get all of the damage working. So we're going to do something like this. On trigger enter collider. So we've already done that. Then we're going to say, okay, we need to get something back. Now we'll talk about the type when we actually write the code. So I'm chickening out of the type for a minute and just saying var, but we need to get some damageable back. You look at the collider, what did we hit? So the collider here comes in here. So the collider comes in, passed into the on trigger enter message. Then we query that for the game object that is attached to that collider. Then we go and get a component of type damageable. Now you can't use the chevrons, the angle brackets here, because that format in Unity is expecting a game object, and iDamageable is not it's expecting something at least that's derived from mono behavior, and iDamageable is not derived from mono behavior, remember. So you have to just do it this other way, get component type of iDamageable. So then something comes back. We'll worry about what the type of that is in a minute when we write the code. Then you can ask a nice question. If damageable, then go ahead and now, forget the brackets for a minute, just take damage on it, okay? Now, it turns out that because this thing that comes back could be one of more than one type, we have to do a cast here, damageable as iDamageable. And we'll see that in the code. We'll use the inspector to help us out. So that's the general pattern we're going to be following. As we get a collision, we find out if the thing's damageable, and if it is, we damage it. So as easy as that on the surface. Now let's go ahead and actually implement that. So exactly the plan that I basically had on the slide. We need to talk about a var damageable for the moment, and I'm just going to follow the plan. It's collider that came into this message here, dot game object that it's attached to, dot. Now, let's take a look at the slide. Get component type of damageable. Okay, let's do that. Get component, and then open brackets type of damageable, iDamageable. Now, I'm not getting any autocomplete coming up in my Visual Studio right now, so that's annoying. So I'm going to close Visual Studio and close my other copy of Visual Studio. And then I'm just going to reopen Projectile here and see if that helps me get my autocomplete, because it reduces your chance of errors. So now, what is the type of damageable that's coming back? It's a component. Okay, so let's call it component type. Let's give it the specific type, and I'm even going to rename it damageable component. So let's understand what that means before we do anything else. Quick issue here, I'm misspelling iDamageable. That's what I meant about getting your autocomplete working. It really helps reduce those errors. So let's now, instead of printing out what the projectile hit, let's just borrow that print message and print out the damageable component. Okay, so let's just say damageable component equals. I want to show you something about what comes back here from this damageable component. And let's just print out its value for various things we're hitting. So we're going and getting a component of the game object we hit. So for example, if we hit this enemy, then the enemy is the game object. The component that we're looking for is a component of type damageable. So we're looking for something that has a script that has a damageable interface, which currently the enemy does not, and the player does. Okay, so the player implements damageable, the enemy doesn't. So let's see how that manifests itself. Let's grab this ball and move it around. Now, so I use the green, then in fact it might even be easier to look from above by hitting the Y there. Zoom out a little bit. Okay, Let's get the console open. Now, if I go over an enemy, what is happening? Let's make sure I'm definitely colliding with that enemy. You can see his head popping out the top there. That looks great. Nothing's logging apart from damageable component equals blank every time I go in and out of the enemy, okay? So we're getting a null for the damageable component, yet when I go over the player, I get damageable component equals player. So the good thing about this component, it is a nullable value. So where we look inside the projectile here, I need to just reopen projectile. It's closed itself. 1 second. Here we go. Okay, so this thing's nullable. So what we can do now is we can just say if damageable component, then now we need to look at how we do the method call. So if we're hitting something that has not got a script on it that implements damageable, for example, at the moment, enemy does not implement damageable because we haven't said comma I damageable here, then we'll get nothing back at this point and this code will not run, okay? Simple enough. But if we have hit something that is damageable, well, then what was our recipe? We said that we were going to call take damage. Now, you can't quite just call it because this damageable component, remember, in the case of a player, is both a mono behavior, specifically a player that inherits from mono behavior, and an iDamageable. So we have to have some way of telling the code which it should be treated as. So what we do is we say damageable component as iDamageable, and that's a cast. Now, if you put that in brackets and go dot, you can say take damage. And then the amount of damage you should take, well, we should be exposing this, shouldn't we? So let's do a serialized field, damage, and oops, just damage, or damage caused, let's say, just to disambiguate it, and I'm going to give it a sensible value of 10 as a float. And of course it doesn't have a type, so serialized field float damage caused equals 10, and then we can take that amount of damage. Cool, let's see if we actually do take that amount of damage on the player, which is the one that we've implemented on. So go to the scene view, grab the ball, push it into the player. Actually, you know what we did? I think at some point we disabled the UI on this player, didn't we? No, it didn't. It's here in the game view. So that's okay. Let's just play. Let's move the ball forcibly over the player like so. And then see his damage has reduced. You see, he's taken a lump of damage. You can even see it on the UI. Let's do it again. And he's taken lots of damage, presumably because there were lots of hits there. That is awesome. That means that the player is taking damage from through that interface, and that's working really nicely. So where are we? How to find game objects by interface. We have done that, and we have also done how to call a method from an interface. So here was your code that allows you to actually make the call. We don't need this print. It's relatively simple. Once you get your head around the idea that you need to go and find a component that may or may not be damageable, and you ask if it's damageable, and if it is, you call the take damage method on it, all right? So this projectile code now doesn't need to change. That will work for any damageable game object. We can even boldly close that file. What I want you to do is get damage working for both ways. So basically, I want the damage to work on the player and the enemy. Damage should be taken in both cases. Expose a damage amount on the projectile. Well, I've done that for you. And the health bars should update. So what we're basically saying is that when we put that massive, ridiculous projectile into the enemies, then they should be taking damage, using a very similar paradigm to what I've just showed you. So go ahead, pause the video, and see if you can get that working now and implement what we've learned. Okay, welcome back. Let's take a look at this then. Well, by using inspiration from how this worked over on the player, we're going to end up duplicating a load of code. Now, we may centralize this code later, but remember the rule of 3. When you do something for a third time, you centralize your code. For the moment, we may deal with things differently between a player and an enemy, so I'm not going to worry about the fact that this code is repeated the second time. I would the third time. So I'm now saying I want the enemy to implement the damageable interface. It's saying, well, you've got to tell me how to take damage, so I will. I think I'm also, just while I'm here, going to fix this getter up in terms of its layout. It's a very minor thing. I just find it's taking up too many lines on the screen, and that's slightly upsetting my eyes. So I'm just going to fix the bracketing strategy here. It's kind of personal choice, all right? So I am going to do it the same way as we did before. I'm going to say a public void, and because it's public, you know what? I want to put it at the top of the class. And I want to do the same on the player. So let's do that. Public void take damage. It's already at the top of the class in the player, but in the enemy, I'm going to use a very, very similar method. In fact, let's use the same method. Cutting and pasting code once is in my book okay. I'm even going to put it above start because it's something that we could call. This is the contract, right, of this class. This is what we could do with it. So current health points, which we already have, is exactly the same. Exactly the same implementation of damage on the player. Now, because it's damageable, that should be all we have to do. Let's have a look, which is pretty cool. That shows you the power of it. We had to do very little there, and we haven't affected the player either. So let's have a look in the game. This enemy has already taken damage from the ball. Let's just wipe the ball through the enemies a little bit, come back to the game view. Look, they're taking the damage. Isn't that cool? Enemies are being damaged by the projectile as well. Now, we may well not want the player to take damage from the projectile, but that's a different issue. What we've done here is we've made sure that the same code can cause damage to a player, to an enemy, and also to, a barrel or something. We can come over here and say, well, this is a chopping. I'm going to get rid of this wacky cottage instance because it's dead. We have a chopping stump and logs over here. There would be nothing to stop us putting some behavior on here and making it also able to be taking damage. And that would be cool as well. Now, when we get to a third time of using health points, then maybe we separate out this code about the health points simply into a component, and we work on the component rather than directly on the player or enemy. But we've only done it twice so far. That's not a problem right now. This is cool because we can make changes like this. We can make other things damageable without worrying about the implementation from the caller, i.e. the projectile doesn't care how things take damage, and also without changing any of the code on the projectile, so it's much more stable. So that is pretty cool. Just going to check for any errors, etc. And then we are in a situation where we have damage on both. So then we need to focus on actually spawning a projectile out of the player so that he can deal some damage in a more sensible way.